Hello and welcome to this module on climate change mitigation, sustainable development goals, and carbon markets and their implications for land. In this module, we will revise our understanding of the causes of climate change and the existential threat posed by it, which we also covered in our previous module. We will then proceed to understand the concept of sustainable development and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We will briefly learn about the overall approach to dealing with climate change, which consists of three key approaches: climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and geoengineering. We will also delve into climate mitigation solutions, including the ones involving land. Finally, we will learn about carbon markets, key carbon trading systems, and their implications for land. As we learnt in the previous module, climate change is the increasingly irregular and unpredictable behavior of the climate system due to the steep rise in greenhouse gas concentrations, such as that of carbon dioxide, well above its level before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. This steep rise in greenhouse gases has been caused by the large-scale untrammeled combustion of carbon-heavy fossil fuels such as coal, petroleum, and natural gas. The rise in greenhouse gas levels has resulted in an increasing fraction of the sun's heat getting trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. This excess heat capture is causing an increase in average global temperatures, which is understood as global warming. Climate change is the destabilizing effect of this global warming on the world's climate system. Climate change, along with other risks such as that of a worldwide pandemic and nuclear war, can be understood as an existential risk, a threat which could potentially end human civilization if urgent steps are not taken. The global economy continues to be heavily reliant on fossil fuels for its electricity, transportation, indoor and industrial heating requirements. This dependence will lead to increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and more global warming. The increasingly destabilizing effect of such global warming on the world's climate system is already manifesting and is likely to manifest in more severe heat waves, harsher winters, cyclones and typhoons, wildfires, droughts, etc. This will be in addition to the sea level rise caused by global warming due to the melting of massive Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets, which already threatens major global cities such as New York and densely populated countries such as Bangladesh. It is these broad spectrum threats from climate change across many fronts and at many levels which makes it an existential threat and requires us to revisit the very concept of conventional development and transition to clean energy based sustainable economy. Conventional development or business as usual development prioritizes near-term economic growth as the main goal and sanctions the unrestricted exploitation of cheap, abundant but carbon-heavy fossil fuels to power large-scale, low-cost manufacturing and transportation required to achieve this goal. It seeks to alleviate poverty in two key ways: accelerating economic growth so a larger economy with more sectors is able to employ higher numbers of people, and through social welfare wherein people without the basic skills to do well in the industrial economy are provided with subsidies by the state. A key problem with this development model is that it does not take serious consideration of the capacities of key environmental systems such as the atmosphere and major ecosystems such as the Amazon rainforest when pushing for resource extraction for rapid economic growth. This results in existential risks such as climate change and other serious risks such as biodiversity loss and overfishing as the tolerance of major environmental systems is exceeded. This in turn threatens the long-term survival of humanity and of this development model. Sustainable development differs in important ways from conventional development. The concept was introduced in 1987 in a report titled Our Common Future, released by the Brundtland Commission, also known as the World Commission on Environment and Development, named after Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable development emphasizes balancing three key goals: economic development, environmental conservation, and social equity or social justice. The United Nations has come up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals to enable the world to transition to sustainability. These goals include no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnership for the goals. Let us now try and understand how the concept of sustainable development applies to the approaches to deal with climate change. There are three main approaches to deal with climate change that have been identified in the scholarly literature, which accords them varying levels of importance: mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering. Climate change mitigation involves measures to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Climate change adaptation involves measures to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. Climate change geoengineering entails deliberate, large scale alteration of the climate system to counter climate change. Climate mitigation involves measures to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, such as energy efficiency measures in existing coal power plants. It also involves switching of energy sources. For example, building more solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear power plants instead of emissions heavy coal plants. Other measures include greater use of electric vehicles, mass transit systems, and more stringent mileage standards for petrol and diesel vehicles. Upgrading building infrastructure with energy efficient bulbs, using less energy intensive agricultural cultivation methods, policies to encourage walking and biking, planting more trees, and reducing rates of deforestation also fall under the ambit of climate change mitigation. Mitigation measures also consist of policies to encourage development of carbon capture and sequestration technology to prevent the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by redirecting them through pipelines into large underground cavities such as abandoned oil wells. As we can see from our discussion so far, climate change mitigation has profound implications for land. Designing cities to be more pedestrian and bike friendly requires careful urban planning and consideration of land use. Reducing rates of deforestation also requires sophisticated approaches to mapping of forest lands, surveying of forest cover, determination of carbon fixation of rates, and decisions regarding whether to concentrate efforts to reduce deforestation. Similarly, planting more trees also requires careful land use planning and an equally careful surveying of available land such as wastelands and abandoned lands for aggressive tree plantation drives. More sophisticated agricultural practices such as organic farming, lower fertilizer use, and lesser use of fuel-intensive heavy agricultural machinery also comes under the ambit of climate mitigation and requires careful land use planning and allocation. In order to enable rapid climate mitigation to occur and for carbon emissions to be reduced in the fastest possible time, in the largest possible volume, at the lowest possible cost, the right incentives for the same need to be created. Carbon markets are attempts to create an incentive for pollution reducing entities such as industries to benefit from their efforts, and to create a disincentive for continuously polluting industries to continue with this undesirable practice. Carbon markets are also known as emissions trading schemes or cap and trade schemes. Emissions trading schemes such as the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme and the California Cap and Trade Scheme place a cap on total emissions. This cap is then divided into individual permits or licenses to pollute that are then freely given or auctioned to target industries such as power plants based on their prevailing level of emissions. Think of a permit of 1 ton of carbon as a license to a receiving power plant to emit 1 ton of carbon per year. In an environment where the emissions of industries are likely to grow year on year, the cap on total national regional emissions is held steady and in fact begins to reduce with each passing year. With the reduction in the cap, the total number of permits in the system also begins to reduce. With the decline in the number of permits, there is now competition between industries for increasingly scarce permits to cover their emissions. In this situation, the industries that undertake energy efficiency and technology upgradation measures are able to successfully reduce their emissions below the number of permits assigned to them and end up with a surplus of permits. They can now sell these excess permits for a profit to industries that are unable to reduce their emissions and end up requiring excess permits. Cap and trade systems have been successful in rapidly reducing carbon emissions at low cost, as they do not specify the exact manner in which emissions should be reduced, but merely impose an economy-wide cap on emissions and create a carbon market in which profit-seeking industries reduce their emissions in order to sell their permits to industries that are not able to do so. Although the agricultural sector has not been brought under the European Union emissions trading scheme yet, there are plans to do so in the near future. The agricultural sector in developed countries has a significant carbon emissions footprint with its heavy use of fertilizers, larger land parcels that require heavy machinery, focus on maximum possible output from a given land parcel, and emphasis on transporting harvest long distances to distant markets. By bringing such a sector under the emissions trading scheme, incentives can be created for farmers to adopt more energy efficient and resource efficient agricultural practices in order to end up with a surplus of carbon credit allowances that can be sold for a profit in carbon stock exchanges to industries or farmers that need them. There are concerns about how such an emissions trading scheme would accurately measure emissions on a farm and how it would treat small farmers. But these concerns can be addressed through careful design of the emissions trading scheme. Another interesting innovation in enabling sustainable development goals is the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism. The Clean Development Mechanism was announced under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The CDM allows developed countries the flexibility to reduce their emissions at a lower cost by funding projects in developing countries which contribute to local sustainable development. For example, the CDM has been used to build solar power plants and wind projects in India, while also funding and supporting afforestation initiatives. The emissions reductions achieved by such clean development mechanism projects in developing countries is used to generate certified emissions reductions or CER or carbon credits, with each such reduction amounting to 1 ton of carbon. These CERs can be sold and traded in a carbon market and used by developed countries to reduce their emissions in keeping with their emissions reductions commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, the world's first legally binding treaty requiring developed countries to reduce their emissions. Given all that we have discussed so far, it is clear that climate change mitigation, sustainable development, and carbon markets are all interrelated and have profound implications for land. Because action on climate change requires the creation of incentives such as carbon markets and carbon credits, in addition to traditional instruments like regulation, there is now an opportunity to view our land resources as potential carbon sinks and generators of tradable carbon permits. Whether it's agricultural land, forest land, tribal land, pastoral land, communal land, wasteland, or any other type of land, carefully designed, socially inclusive, and socially sensitive projects can be designed to reduce emissions and generate carbon credits for trading under the Clean Development Mechanism. Or the cap and trade system, such as the one in Europe, can be extended from core sectors such as the power sector to also include land-intensive agriculture in a manner that incentivizes farmers to reduce emissions, generate credits, and trade them in the emissions exchange. Done carefully with regulations to safeguard against abuse, carbon markets could give much needed impetus to our fight against climate change by reducing emissions across the economy while also preserving ecologically and culturally vital forest and tribal lands. Small farmers, tribals, small landowning businesses, and others stand to benefit enormously from the reduction of emissions, generation of surplus carbon credits, and the sale of such credits in the emissions exchange. In this module, we learnt about climate change, the existential risk it poses, the approach to combat climate change, and climate change mitigation. We also learnt about sustainable development goals, carbon markets, and their implications for land. The growing threat from climate change and the expansion of mitigating actions such as carbon markets promises to deepen and widen the availability of incentives for actors ranging from farmers to power plant operators to reduce their emissions and to profit from this reduction via carbon credits. Communities closer to land, such as farmers and tribals, stand to benefit from carbon markets provided they are designed properly to avoid fraud and to allow the accurate tracking of emissions. In combination with traditional regulations, carbon markets stand positioned to revolutionize the fight against climate change. Thank you for your attention.